Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane. I'm the director of the Ashland Public Library in Massachusetts, and I'm very, very excited to be here with Jennifer McCord, who I hadn't met her before. We talked a little bit, but she is like just the guru of romance publishing. She's been doing it for a long time and is going to tell us a lot about how she got started, what is going on in the romance publishing world, and some of maybe her stories of the grand dames of romance. I have lots of questions and I hope you do too. But before we get to that, I wanted to say thanks to the Friends of the Ashland Public Library for supporting all of our programming. And I would like to thank Jennifer for letting us share this program with other libraries. And I think like 13 or 14 jumped on the opportunity to partner with us on this. And as anybody who knows me knows that I think when libraries work together, we make magic. So it's really awesome. So Jennifer, let's start with you. Tell me a little bit about who you are and what you do now.
Okay, I'm Jennifer McCord. I have a company called Jennifer McCord and Associates, and I'm a creativity coach. And I also work with independent authors who want to self-publish, but I also have been working with publishers in New York and small press publishers in the Northwest about their business. I also am now associate publisher and editorial director of a small press in the Kenmore. It's outside of Seattle, and we were founded in Alaska. And then the press bought three other imprints from another company that was started in Seattle. So it's Coffeetown, Camel, and Fanny. So we have published some erotica. We have published genre fiction and literary fiction and memoir. So that's been very interesting to be on the editorial side and the publishing side. I am a former bookseller.
Mm-hmm.
So
Okay,
I was a bookseller for many years.
it's amazing. You have such a great history. We're going to get into that. I did want to tell people if you have a question for Jennifer to put it in the Q&A, which is a button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I will be kind of paying attention to the chat, but sometimes it goes by very quickly and I don't catch questions. So I'm going to start. Jennifer, did you start out as a reader? Is that something that you've always done and that's what led you to this?
So I was thinking about this, and I started reading when I was about 3.5 years old. I went to an early childhood education program at the University of Minnesota, and I can remember, you'll love this, climbing up to the little place. They had a library,
Mhm.
and I could climb up the ladder and go pick up a book if I could read a sentence. And I read a sentence so I could go pick up a book I wanted to look at and start to learn how to read. I have been an avid reader ever since then. I come from a family where my mother read all the time and we discussed books. And so when I was thinking about this in the late 1970s, I had some kind of infection in my system, and my doctor said, I'm going to give you a strong antibiotic. That's his words. Go to the library and pick up a bunch of books and go lie in bed and read. And so I dashed up to my local library and I grabbed a whole bunch of stuff off the racks and everything, came home, and there was a Harlequin omnibus. They were little hardcovers, leather, kind of fake leather binding. And I sat and read three books in one, and I thought, I feel really happy after reading these books. And it was started me reading romance. And so what did I do? I read romance. I just read as many books as I could read, and I read a couple books a day. And a fast reader. And then I was in Denver, Colorado, and there was a store manager's job, and I was there, and my teenage daughter said, "Hey, you want?" I said, "I really like that job." She said, "Why don't you go apply?" I went and applied. I got the job, and I started working in that store.
Mhm.
And I realized I had read a lot of the store.
Mhm.
In the midst of that time when I started, Dell Candlelight came out.
Hmm.
And I remember the Dell sales rep coming in the store and showing us this and saying what it was. And I thought, hey, this will be interesting. They'll see how we do this, because we had already carried Harlequin. And
Mhm.
we also had carried a couple other romance lines. And I was trying to think of what they were, and I had that at the tip of my fingers and can't remember. But
Wasn't Dell Candlelight Regencies?
no, They were contemporary romances.
Oh,
Jayne
okay.
Krentz and Amy Lauren published the first ones. And I can remember reading Gentle Pirate,
Mm,
Jane Castle.
yep, yep.
And I
Oh,
thought, oh, wow, that was great. We
mhm.
sold 75 copies of the first 2 books in about 2 days.
Wow. Hold on a second. I want to go back a little bit and
Yeah,
ask how old were you when you read those first, that Harlequin Omnibus?
it was probably in my 20s, late 20s.
Okay. And had you read romance before then?
I think I had read Nurse Romance when
Mm-hmm.
I was a teenager.
Mm-hmm.
And
Uh,
I had read Rebecca,
mm-hmm.
and I had read historical romances, Mary Stuart, Madeline Brent.
Mm-hmm.
I had read those. I had and then I had when I read those, I started reading Phyllis Whitney
Mm-hmm.
and Victoria Holt. So I read the historical parts,
I
and I had
love
not read the
Victoria.
contemporaries.
I was a huge Victoria Holt fan. Huge.
Right.
Um, okay.
And for years wanted to know who the heck Madeline Brent really was.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
And
I don't know. She was supposedly some royal who was writing.
oh my gosh, they're
Yeah,
right up there with Barbara Cartwright. Cartwright?
yeah, Cartland.
Cartland. I'm thinking of mixing up like Bonanza or
Yeah.
something. So, okay, so now you're in this bookshop. Your daughter has said you
Yeah,
need to get
yeah,
this
so
done.
I started working in the bookshop and saw, we sold some silhouettes. We were selling Harlequin, we were selling McFadden, and then we sold the Del Candlelight, and we sold out of what we had.
Mhm,
And that started this whole thing. And then Second Chance at Love came on.
mhm,
And so I was there during all these category books were starting, these stories were the lines were starting. And what struck me is how readers just always looked for it, and they knew when the books would be coming out, and they would come to the store
mhm,
and check if they were there. And if they knew if there was a snowstorm somewhere, hey, it might be late this week. Um, so that taught me how loyal and devoted the readers were. And
mhm,
there was a used bookstore up the street, so I also checked into that.
mhm,
And that was interesting. And I got to talk to the readers. Why were they reading this? What did they like about it? And I learned that. And then in the midst of this, my husband had a job offer in Seattle. So we came back to Seattle, and a friend of mine said, "Oh, this friend is running a bookstore downtown, and it was a Walden bookstore." And I went and worked there. And in the midst of all this, the romance business was starting to really take off. And because I had known the sales reps from the Denver area, they told me who was in the Seattle area. And so I got to talk to sales reps. Usually sales reps would sometimes come and call in Walden's at that day. So I knew some of them. I also started getting manuscripts sent to me. Got manuscripts from Star Helmer and started reading the manuscripts. And then that started this whole thing of paying attention to what was coming in the store, how it was selling, the readers who were coming in. And then Walden Books got into the club, the romance book club.
mm.
And so what it was is buy 6, get 1 free of the category books. So that,
I was in that club.
yes.
Yes.
So that, and we had a newsletter that came out every 2 months.
Mhm,
And what it talked about category romance and interviewed writers, interviewed readers.
mhm,
And so that happened. In the midst of this, the president of Walden Books was at a meeting that I was at. And I had somehow met a couple of people, or heard I talked to a couple of people, other Walden Books people across the country. And someone said, if you talk to this president, tell him this. So I made a little list of stuff that I thought could help improve our sales. And he said, I'll see you in New York in 2 weeks. And I thought, oh, yeah, well, who knows? Well, that started me being part of this romance expert committee.
mhm,
And there were 4 of us, and the person who was president of the Romance Book Club.
mhm,
And so we met, and then I became they selected me to be the spokesperson
mhm,
about the romance industry to the industry.
mhm. I'm going to
So
go back to Denver for a minute, and we are
yeah,
getting some questions, but I'm going to hold off on them
yeah,
just a little bit while we get through like sort of your history.
right.
Um, when you were in Denver, one of the things you had said to me was that you were actually hand selling these books. You were telling people
Yeah.
about them. You were marketing them even before you knew that you were actually marketing. So what did you do that maybe other stores were not doing to sell the romance in your store?
Well, first place we carried the books.
Mhm. Yeah, that's huge.
We carried the books, we unpacked the books.
Mhm.
And the way this books were displayed in the store also helped. But I think it was also the fact that we had them. We kept them
Mhm.
going, and we kept the backlist going too. We
Mhm.
didn't return the books
So
right away.
what was it about you that did that? Because obviously they're selling. Why in bookstores are in business to make money. So why are other bookstores not doing this back in the 70s when these books were really like candy?
Because I had the owner of the bookstore knew merchandising.
Mhm.
She knew that, and she said to me, um, you know, she said, "I will teach you what I know." And she wanted to make the store profitable. So
Mhm.
she was geared to what she told me, quite frankly, "Put your taste aside and look at what's selling." And so we used to bet on books, and we bet on, books that we thought would sell or wouldn't sell. And they weren't romance per se, but they were just books in the store. And I can still remember Richard Simmons' diet book.
Yep.
Yep, and she thought that would sell, and I thought, "Oh, that's never gonna sell." Well, I owed her dinner over that one, and then I realized that she gave me somewhat of a free hand to begin to order some books because I had gone to some of the, trade shows, and picked books and they sold in the store, so then it became like I got to test out my own taste
Mhm.
against the what was going on. And then, realized that, and then I went to work about in the midst of all this, I left that store and went to another store for about 6 weeks, and it was a very esoteric, very literary bookstore, and all the books that I had picked at the other store sold at this other store, so I began to realize that where the customer goes matters.
Mhm.
What this customer, because I was right next to the University of Denver, that was a completely different audience,
Mhm.
readers.
Mhm.
The other store was a mile away, completely different audience.
Mhm.
So that taught me that kind of thing about retail.
Mhm.
But I realized that I would just talk to readers. I would listen to why they were reading. What did they like? And I was, tell me if you didn't like a book.
Mhm.
I was willing to hear the good and the not so good.
And what do you remember hearing people saying back then about why they liked romance?
I think what was interesting to me, and I have a couple of really great stories. When I was in the one in downtown Seattle, we had some regular customers who came in. We had a woman who was 90 and she would come in and tell me how much she loved the books and why she loved them. She just enjoyed the reading, she enjoyed the writing, and she really liked certain writers' voices. Um, a couple of books came in. One of them was by Lee Damon, I believe, and it was a story about abuse and the woman who had left a relationship. And I can remember readers standing in the corner crying and buying a second book to give to friends because of the storyline.
Mhm.
And that was the romance, but it was with a difficult subject.
Mhm.
And then I remember a woman came in and she was buying a little category romance of those, silhouette. And the main character was going to be was a plumber, female. And this woman came in and said, "I'm so glad that I read this book because my daughter wants to be a plumber. And I didn't think it would be possible to find happily ever after if you were a plumber. And so now I'm gonna support that."
Oh my gosh.
So
Romance changes lives.
I had stories like that. I, almost uh every time there would be a story that was similar to something like that. I also had the fact that writers who wrote good settings,
Mhm.
even if it was historical, And if a reader went to that setting and it was accurate,
Mhm.
they would always think, they'd say, they'd say, Jennifer, that book was so accurate that when I went to that town, I knew where it was.
Wow. That's, I have been there. I've learned most of my history through romance, so I'm hoping it's as accurate as can be. But so what um what made you go, like, when you now you're in this new place in Seattle, and are you having as much interaction with readers as you were before?
No, because I'm not in a bookstore.
Okay.
When I was in a bookstore. So what happened to me with this unusual job, which was just an amazing job because the category business was just moving and growing and changing and all that kind of thing. Um, is that also, because of who I worked with at Walden Books, I essentially got my own office, and I would go work at all the different stores in the Northwest.
Mhm.
And so I got to talk to various readers from different parts of the Northwest. I also was working with this committee, and our committee was a woman in the Midwest and then a woman in the Washington, D.C. area. And we would talk about our readers. What did our readers like? What do we think our readers would like?
Mhm.
And so where this woman who was she was more in the Oklahoma area, Texas area, she would not be able to sell paranormal
Mm.
as much as the woman in DC could sell.
Mhm.
And that's part of the culture of where the stores were.
Mhm.
And that was always interesting to me,
Mhm.
is to find out what kind of storyline, what kind of setting, what would happen. And we were asked, we were supposed to, what we did is every month we would get the list of books that were going to be coming out 6 months or 9 months ahead from, and what Walden Books was looking at, and we would be discussing it amongst ourselves what we thought would happen, or did we like an author, did we think an author should be pushed a little more, or do we think a story was really maybe potential to take off. But the thing is, Walden Books was in competition with B. Dalton, and so we wanted to make sure that we were essentially doing better than B. Dalton in romance.
Mhm.
That
I don't actually remember either of those stories having a ton of romance, but maybe I was just going to the library a lot. Um, so what I know, when we talked earlier, you really didn't like the term bodice ripper. Um, can you talk about that a little bit? How that came about? What is the perception of?
I don't know if, because I didn't coin the name that bodice ripper. I think that was somebody else did that a long
Mhm.
time ago before my time in the business.
Mhm.
I think part of it was the fact that if you were doing, I was being interviewed a lot. And I would go to, Walden Books would have regional manager meetings,
Mhm.
and I would go talk about the romance category in those meetings and why did that matter to a store,
Mhm.
and what could it matter to the customer that was coming in. And Walden Books was really smart enough in their marketing department to do some research. And so I would give a kind of a little talk about the perception of the reader was that they had purple hair, polyester pantsuit, and purple clothes. And our readers were all over the map and all different kinds of economic backgrounds.
Mhm.
And if they came to the store, we had some numbers of how much they would spend and what else they would buy. And so if you had a romance reader in the store, it wasn't just buying a romance book too, although they bought a lot of romance books. It was the other things. They would buy books for their kids, they buy magazines, they buy a cookbook, they buy nonfiction, depending. And this one of our people on the committee, she was in the DC area, and in her store, she always said, "Is I have the maids and the diplomats."
Hmm.
And I always thought that was a great description of the store reader that she had.
Mhm.
And so my romance reader is not considered poor and pathetic,
Mhm.
because there was that image. And so I was always trying to stress the fact that our the readers who read romance are just everyday women from all walks of life and like all different kinds of stories, which the genre always has always been.
Mhm.
It's a lot of different stories. They borrow from everything, mystery, horror, fantasy, whatever. And so the question would come to you, well, what do you think of talking about the bodice rippers? And have you had sex with your husband lately?
Oh my gosh.
That kind of stuff would happen. I wasn't always asked that, but if I was with a group of writers on a radio show or something, that's what they'd be asked. And so it was always like, I didn't think that was always, if you're trying to get respect for a genre. So let me just talk a little bit about that. One of the things that Walden Books in the industry and people in the industry started to do is try to make sure that we were putting ISBNs on the back of the book so the sales would really be shown up and that they would start to show up on bestseller lists and not considered non-books.
Mm-hmm.
Because some of the people who started in the romance, things like McFadden and stuff like that, they were more from the magazine side. There was the whole issue of what was called the ID wholesalers, which were the magazine people, and they were the people that racked all the romance books. So people made the assumption they were just magazines, you could just throw them away. We were always just trying to be really show that these books, the writers who wrote them, they were a genre to pay attention to.
Mm-hmm.
And to get on the New York Times bestseller list, to crack that,
Mm-hmm.
to crack getting reviewed in PW. Sybil Steinberg just died.
Mm-hmm.
And she was she was in charge of the reviews on PW.
Oh.
And she had me interview Jayne Krentz as a romance writer to be one of the first romance writers ever reviewed
Mm-hmm.
as, an interview type thing with a writer. And then Daisy Marlis.
Mm-hmm.
She also she came to Romance Writers of America. She went out and talked to writers groups. She came in, saw the fact that that was important to cover that genre in PW because we weren't covered in PW. This is taken for granted now, but that wasn't what was happening then.
Stephanie
And
said she remembers the Krantz interview, so you made an impact.
oh yeah, then the other thing is so that was really important to kind of get that. It's Krantz, Krentz. Anyway, yeah, so we were trying to show that what was going on. And Walden Books then also gave away awards at RWA. We gave away yearly awards about the bestsellers, and they were all based on sales.
Mm-hmm. Okay,
Over
so that's why you needed the ISBN as well, so you could
Well, we wanted that because we also had a bestseller list. We put out a bestseller list every month.
Mm-hmm. I do remember that.
Yeah, for mystery too, and science fiction. It wasn't, it was across the board. It was just in general, books having an ISBN mattered. I can remember even guidebooks that didn't have ISBNs. Yeah. So what the other part was, we gave these awards away, and it was a very specific, time frame, and we would give them away, and we would try to recognize the authors who had, done well with Walden Books.
Mm-hmm. I think that is really interesting, given that how we all grew up and went to Walden Books and B. Dalton, and there was no Amazon or anything like that. So let's talk a little bit about your interviewing of major writing stars in the romance genre. Tell us a little bit about the people that you interviewed, how that came about. Well, who are your, like, I'll go one question at a time. Who do you remember interviewing?
I didn't interview.
Oh.
We didn't. I interviewed Jayne Krentz for PW. I would write a column for RWA. I mean, for Walden Books, and then Walden Books and More, and then it became Borders, and it was WB, and I would write a column that would talk about books that were coming in the future. But I didn't interview the authors. I interviewed the publishers.
Oh,
And
okay.
I would go to Romance Writers of America or writers conferences to talk with the writers about what they were writing.
Mm-hmm.
What were the stories that they were writing? And when did they have their next book coming out? And then that was important information that I would communicate to the company. Here's so and so's starting a new series or whatever, just to kind of feed the buyer what was going on
Mm-hmm.
from what we saw. So Frances Perrine and I and Mary Gregg would go to these conferences and we would talk to the writers. And they were a lot of fun to sit and talk to them and talk about their stories. What were they writing? What did they want to write?
So who do you remember chatting with at RWA or just in the course of your work that we would recognize at this time, 30, 40
Well,
years later?
I think one of the first authors that I met was LaVryle Spencer.
Okay.
And I was fortunate enough to I also was doing events.
Mm.
So if I met an author and they might be coming through Seattle or being on tour, I'd say make sure to come and do an event at a
Mhm.
Walden bookstore. I remember meeting LaVryle Spencer. I remember meeting Linda Howard.
My favorite.
Yes, I remember meeting Nora Roberts,
Hmm.
Anne Reiser, who used to write for Dale Candlelight. Um, oh, just a we there were kind of I guess you would say evening little chat times that the publishers would have suites, and so we would go to the Bantam suite and we'd go to the Dell suite and we'd go to talk with the Harlequin people and the Silhouette people. And the very first RWA I went to, Silhouette had just been bought by Harlequin.
Hmm.
So
Okay.
that was big news of the day.
Hmm. I'm going to do a little crowdsourcing here and ask for
Yeah,
people to say in the chat any authors that were writing back then, and we'll ask Jennifer if she met them. Like, for instance, Joanna Lindsay.
I did meet Joanna.
Mhm. I was so sad when she passed away a few years ago. I loved her.
Right.
Although some of her books, I mean, they didn't age well. Rosemary Rogers.
I if I met her, it would be in passing.
Hmm.
At
Okay.
Joanna Lindsay, I believe they had a dinner for her and I went to.
Okay. Sandra Brown.
Met Sandra Brown.
Hmm.
Never
All right, people, help me out here. Kathleen Woodwis. Yes, Kathleen Woodwis.
never did meet Kathleen Woodwis.
Hmm.
Yeah, I
She
wish
seems
I
like,
had.
yes.
Yeah,
The Wolf and
yeah.
the Dove.
Well, yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, that was so I got into the business after a lot of her books were already out.
Hmm.
And I remember then she did a book that it was a trade paperback.
Bertrice Small.
Yes, met Bertrice.
Roberta Gellis.
I think I might have met Roberta.
Okay. Um, who else, people? There were so many wonderful writers. Jude Devereaux.
Met Jude.
She's still writing.
Right.
Oh my gosh. So Julie Garwood, I don't think she wrote back in the 70s and 80s. I think she was more 90s.
No, she wrote in the 80s.
Oh, she did.
Yeah.
Bride is one of my absolute favorite books of all
Yeah.
time.
Yeah. Yeah. I met Julie. She wrote in the late 1980s.
Mhm.
So Walden, RWA came to Seattle for one of their conventions. So I used to do signings. I used to do signings before RWA, before they did their readers
Mhm.
event where they had signings. I used to do signings at Walden Books if I
Mhm.
could.
Mhm.
So I did a signing and I believe Julie was there and Sandra Brown and Lisa Claypaz.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, there was a number of them and some local people too.
Mhm.
And
Um,
I never met Danielle Steele.
no. Okay. Danielle Steele makes me think of LaVryle Spencer, like that kind of writing. Oh my gosh, you were there in the heyday, really, of that
Yeah,
sort of.
and Catherine Coulter.
Yep. Oh my gosh.
Right,
All of her trilogies, and
right. Cynthia Wright,
I don't think I read her.
right, historical,
Mhm.
right. Mhm.
Elizabeth Lowell,
Yep, met Elizabeth Lowell. She was living in the Northwest. Met her.
Luann Rich.
Luann Rice, I met, not
Rice.
Luann. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
Now these are romance writers, for the most part. Were you also meeting authors of other genres?
yeah. Because I was doing events, so
Right.
Gene L,
Mm.
Robert Parker, Elmer Leonard, David Halberstam,
Mhm.
the nonfiction writer.
Mhm.
Um, oh, I have to go back and think of all the people that I've met. I've been super fortunate. Tobias Wolff,
Mhm.
Elizabeth Berg. Um, oh, geez. There's
So she
a
said
number.
Luann Rice, but I was thinking Anne Rice.
No, I never met Anne Rice.
Okay. Stephen King.
I saw him in an elevator once.
Like just passing in the night, huh?
Yeah, I just said hi. That was it.
Oh my gosh, that's hilarious.
And I
Okay.
did meet Patricia Varian too, I think. Yeah.
Oh,
Margaret Barter asked that. Yeah, I believe I met her.
hmm. Wow. So what does it feel like to you to look back at that sort of heyday, know that a lot of those books have not aged all that well?
What do you mean by not aged all that well?
Well, for a current audience, they're a little bit hard to read. The Johanna Lindsay's that I think of, like there was, definitely no consent up until the end, just yeah, it was just a very different writing world. I mean, the writing was wonderful, but the storytelling didn't translate well into the current atmosphere.
So, I think I'm going to answer this from a couple points of view. So one of the things I think that I've always thought was really interesting and unique about the romance business is how romance writers pick up the mores of the time and write about it in
Mhm.
terms of with a relationship. And so like I think of Stephanie Jayne Krantz writing Corporate Affair, just a silhouette book. And I remember that was a lot of people were surprised that a woman could be a businesswoman
Mhm.
and still make a relationship work. And so I thought, okay, so that was kind of the time frame. That was the 80s. That's when a lot of women all suddenly were getting back in the workforce in a different way.
Mhm.
Educational opportunities for women were changing. All these things were changing. And here, this was the result. And I always thought, wow, how interesting that we see this reflected in romance books, what was happening. So I always look at it as a timepiece. If you look at Mark Twain, how he wrote about what was going on then. And that's the issue for publishers is what do you do with a book that's from the past and uses words that now would not be appropriate or people would write about how things were. So in a sense, it's a look at a time frame of what's going on at that time and how people express themselves. And now we have this with the new writers who are writing who are younger have their version of the love story
Mhm.
and what it means. I'm thinking of Colleen Hoover's books
Mhm.
and Rebecca Yarros. What are the characters like? Where do they come from? What happens to them? And I remember so much of, um, well, the stories of that came through. Like we had the abuse stories, we had the alcoholism stories, we had people who were suffering from some kind of chronic illness or had something happen to their family. And then they still were coming out of it and finding romance or finding something that
Mhm.
made their lives meaningful and value with relationships. And it was all these different settings and different storylines. And I always thought that was really interesting.
Mhm.
And I thought it reflected what was going on in the culture.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm going to say that one of my very favorite books was Carla Kelly's Reforming Lord Ragsdale.
Right.
Totally, I'd never read anything like that before. And all the Mary Bellog books, of course, that had very, very different storylines from what you expect. We
And
actually had.
just a minute, Edith Layton wrote a Regency story
Mhm.
where the heroine married this guy who later you find out was gay.
Oh.
And they never, and so his brother was madder than heck at this young heroine because she had, they weren't together. The two brothers, what was going on? Why did you do this? I don't remember the complete all that, but it was an interesting thing that showed up, and I thought, wow.
Mhm.
So that this whole situation of what's going on in the culture, and I'm curious now that speaking of that, I think of Mary Jo Putney has written, some of her books And there was a woman who wrote, Laura
Rainbow
Kinsel.
book, the Rainbow book, I cried so hard.
Yeah. And Laura Kinsel wrote about post-traumatic stress syndrome.
Hmm.
So I think about what's happened. We've come out of COVID. So how is that going to be portrayed and written about
Hmm.
with romance and mystery or whatever? And
Hmm.
how does that work? And so what I did during that time is I went and read books from the 1920s that were bestsellers because I wanted to see how they managed the flu and World War One.
Hmm.
And it's interesting to go look and read now where some of these probably culturally would people think, what would they think about them now? They go, really? Um, but that reflected the artist's interpretation of the time.
Hmm.
And I have to respect that
Hmm.
as a
Yeah.
as a person and as a person who works in the industry.
Yeah. I love that. I love your answer to that because there's been so much shame. There's so much shaming around this genre. We had a panel a couple of years ago just about this, about, why do we still remember the 80s as so, you know, um, fondly with the books, even though they haven't, for some had been aged so well. And Loretta Chase had the best answer to this, just that, that's how people could express their sexuality at the time. And that was, whatever it was at the time, that's what was accepted. And every generation is something different. So I love that answer. Um,
Yeah, yeah, I agree with that. And so, you know, it's a question that's asked. It's a question as an editor and a publisher. I talk with the publisher who owns the company. We ask ourselves this all the time. How do you manage this? How do you manage? I'm working with a mystery writer. He's a former NBA basketball player.
mhm,
He is a white Russian. He was captured by his family, his mother and him and sister were captured by the Japanese as they were in Russia and in Japan. He lived in a concentration camp for a while and ended up finally in the United States when he was about early, probably 10 or 11 in San Francisco. So this is the 1950s. He became a basketball player. He he writes mysteries, and he writes mysteries at the late 60s, early 70s.
mhm,
So how do you talk about what's going on with the Black Panthers,
mhm,
uh, the hippies, all that stuff at that time? How does he cover that? How does he describe it? What does he do? He
mhm.
also played with a whole bunch of people from different backgrounds. He also went and taught in Africa. So we've talked about this discussion about what do we do? How do we manage that?
Mhm.
How
Oh,
do you
wow.
cover that? Yeah, in a genre
Well, that's
that
interesting. That's an interesting perspective because there's the one of like what was being written at that time and how has it aged versus writing now historically and trying to
yes,
not put
right.
21st century sensibilities on.
Yeah, what do you do with that?
Yeah.
And then his sensibilities, the white guy, um, his own sensibilities about being a Russian and being discriminated as an immigrant.
Hmm.
So we have this very interesting story of his.
Yeah.
Um, and so that's the kind of conversations that are so rich when you work with creative world. And I think it's really critical. This is where I think anybody who's writing out there and listening to me, I am so glad you're writing because you're going to help interpret the culture for the future. And
Oh,
when people look back, they're going to go, oh, you know, 20 years from now, you guys suffered this, you went through this. Let me read about whatever or whatever. How did you handle this? It's through the lens of the creative spirit that you find the values of what's going on.
mhm. I find it really interesting, and I do want to have some time for our audience questions as well. But I find it really interesting that throughout the romance history, it's always dealt with issues of what's going on at the times. Like even Jane Austen,
Right. I agree.
the class struggles, you're talking about alcoholism and abuse and so people who think it's just lighthearted mommy porn don't have a clue as to what the reality is.
So that's why the bodice ripper drives that top thing because I don't want to be perceived as porn,
Mm,
mommy porn, or whatever it is. Um, I think that's the other part is to see books that were written by women for women,
mm,
essentially. Or men read them too, but really essentially their market was women,
Mhm.
is to see that work in the marketplace that was so driven by other forces, you know, male publishing in New York City, and to see that women's stories all suddenly were making money,
Mhm.
really kept things going. And so that was the other part, is recognition of that,
Mhm.
that that worked.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, we often hear that people, bookstores and stuff sell romance so they can afford to have those like sort of literary geniuses, which seems so unfair to me. But let me just ask you this question by Ellen. Are you sorry to have met an author that you liked, and after having met them, you really didn't like them as a person? You don't have to name any names, but has it happened to you?
Um, I think that when you, because I met so many people, I was trying to think of all the people that I met, romance and general fiction and nonfiction writers, over the time. Yes, there wasn't probably a time that you met with somebody who you read their work and then you met them in life and you wondered, oh, I wonder how that happened. I think that would be the more the question I'd ask. I also met, like, I met Anne McCaffrey.
Mm,
And I think of, I was so nervous to meet her because I had read her fantasy, but I also had read her romances,
mhm.
which I just loved.
Yeah.
And I'd taken me a number of years that to find out that she was coming to the United States because she was living in Ireland.
Mhm.
And so when the publisher said, "Oh, she's going to be over in your area," and I said, "Oh God, could we get her?" And so she came. And I was so nervous that I usually could talk to most people, but I just barely could say something other than I thought I was so stupid. Oh God, your books have meant so much to me. And
Oh.
yeah, and then she's sat down and we had a little lull. People were coming in, but we had a little lull. And she's ended up talking to me about her life and herself. And I ended up relaxing and we had this great conversation about writing and reading and everything. And I felt honored she gave me her phone number in Ireland. And I just thought I'd made a connection and I felt so valued as a human being to make a connection with an author that I revered.
Mhm.
So I've had those what I call magical moments with people.
That is amazing. I have had those as well, and I don't know if I would have acted even half as professionally as you did. By having just like that like nice gentle conversation, I tend to act a little up a little bit. Anyways, I'm gonna go back to some of these. These are a little bit more current
Yeah,
questions.
sure.
Olivia asks, do you think that social media has helped or hurt the romance genre?
I think the social media has helped and hurt all of us.
Mm, mhm. Yes.
No question. It's a difficult discussion. I think I listened to something the other night about it. Um, I I think I think what I see, and as someone again who's a publisher, is everybody decides to be an editor and critiquer
Mhm.
and a reviewer, and they just decide, hey, have they written a book? Do they know how that works? Have they, dared to put themselves out there like that, like writers do? Because I believe writers have to have guts to put yourself out there and hope that someone likes that. I'm a former musician, and I can remember playing and hoping that people listened to when I played my flute and played solo. I hoped that I could do it, and I could never hear the applause. And I always thought of my mistakes. And so I think so if I was doing it, somebody might write it on social media. Oh, I heard Jennifer play this song. I don't know if she did so well. I just think everybody's a critic.
Mhm.
And so it's all that.
How do you think it's helped?
Um, I think sometimes because of the change in so when I was working in the book selling side and doing events in Seattle, for instance, we had 3 radio stations plus the educational channel.
Mhm.
And we had local shows. We had Seattle Today and we had an evening show, all that stuff. And if an author came to town and we could book them in there, and I used to know the producers and co-producers and all that stuff, and we would try to work, hey, is so and so, well, let's get them into a bookstore. Then I could really see readers come and see the people because they had seen them on TV.
Mhm.
Even through snowstorms and stuff, they would come and make that effort. I thought, oh God, this was so great. And sometimes it wouldn't work, but a lot of times it did.
Mhm.
And then all of a sudden, that whole cable TV exploded. And so there's so many places that you can see everything on TV. I mean, I think of how many streaming things do I have? What do I watch? Where do I go? All this kind of stuff. I'm looking at it from the point of viewer readership. So social media has taken in and it's taken its place of a way to get information out. And so I'm on Facebook, I'm on LinkedIn, but I think if a way to reach a reader, maybe Book Talk, some of the places a way to reach a reader, if that works, then you know, that's what's happening because I also know what's left of the chains. Barnes and Noble's left. Walden's and Borders are gone.
Mhm.
Um, there's a number of small little chains that were around. They're gone. So,
I think indie bookstores are kind of making a comeback, and we do have a Barnes and Noble right up in the same a couple towns over. But yeah, you're right. The avenues for us to meet our authors in person have definitely changed.
right, and there's that part of it too.
Yeah.
And then the other part of it is to get the independent bookstores like bookshop.org to recognize that romance is a really important category.
Mhm.
And
Right.
I've gone and done, the Pacific Northwest Association has a regional book show. I used to go with the sales reps
Mhm.
from various publishers, and we would talk about the romance business and what it could mean to a store, how it could improve your sales, what you could do. And I used to do that. And I used to do that for the libraries too. I would go speak at the University of Washington's School of Librarianship to try to educate librarians. Hey, you want customers to come in and read? Do this. So I was always trying to be there on that side of
Mhm.
that.
Mhm.
Um, so social media is somewhat probably taken some of those avenues over. Um, but I think what it's hard to know is who are you reaching and where?
Right. What's the impact? Um,
Yeah, because like our local television show, you pretty much knew it was in the Seattle Northwest area.
mhm. Right. We libraries buy lots and lots of digital books and and it should be noted to no surprise to anybody here that the romance is always the most highly circulated in our digital catalogs. It's also the cheapest. You can get, Harlequins for a couple bucks and they just go out like the candy, like I said. Um, Not a surprise. So Emily says or asks, what do you see as a strength or weakness of traditional publishing in reacting to trends in romance?
Um, I'm not sure what she means by that.
I think
Um,
it's like what we were talking about before we started in terms of like, can traditional publishing, pivot quickly enough? Is it able to keep up with things like there's a huge demand for monster romance right now, let's say. Can it keep up?
so those are fads,
Uh-huh. Okay.
and so fads come and go. So what I see happening is traditional publishing because of the kind of way they have to publish. In other words, you usually traditional publishers have it's narrowed the time frame now, but it takes sometimes a year to get out
Mhm.
because you have to get into the publishing list and what else they have. They also have their budgets. They have to figure out how they're going to do it, and so it's a business model, a complicated business model.
Mhm.
Does it always go after trends? Probably not, as opposed to indie self-publishing, which is more can be more trend or fad oriented because you can get them out in a couple of days or a month or however you want to do that, provided that um that does happen. Now I have judged for a number of years. I judged an next indie book awards for the romance category because I was curious about it, and I saw the various levels of self-publishing. There's
Mm.
some really great self-publishing, and there's some self-publishing that people haven't spent the time to even know how to design a book.
Mhm.
And when I was a bookseller, and I would see self-published authors come in with a book. That was always the thing, is this book even something we can try to sell?
Mhm,
And how to do it. And the Northwest was really well known for some phenomenal self-published books
mhm,
that went on to become national bestsellers. So we were used to seeing that and figuring that out. But does it respond to the trend? It's hard to respond to a trend. It's just like the clothing business. Does it respond to a trend? Like the grocery store business, does it respond to a trend? You think of it in the big retail, the idea of retail.
mhm,
What can respond to a trend? How long does it take to get something made? How long does it take to get into the pipeline
mhm.
of distribution?
Yep. Wow. Things we don't think about when we have that
Oh,
book in our hand. So I want to go back to one story you told me before I asked Lisa's question about how you discovered Sharon's Sala. How did that happen?
well, I was working as a reader for Kate Duffy at Meteor Publishing. Meteor Books was out of Philadelphia. And I was reading the slush pile, the stuff they would get in from agents and from everybody. She was doing That's how she did that. And Sharon Sala was in one of those. And I think she came in through an agent, but it was in the pile. And I read it and saw it by that Kate.
I love this story because Sharon Sala is amazing, but also it's so arbitrary. You could have picked up another one and been like, no, or you know what I mean? Like just that particular day, you picked up the right book.
No, I think it's years of reading.
Mm, mhm,
It's reason I've got a little sign in my office says, you know what, when you read it.
mhm,
And I think there's that part of it. Anybody who's a reader, anybody who's a bookseller and looks at books. I mean, we used to, because again, I worked for a national chain, books would come in and you would read them. We could read them and you would begin to know. I can remember when nonfiction book megatrends came in. This is the 80s. I can remember looking at it, taking a look. And when a reader that I knew came in and bought 5 copies, I thought, okay, we have to get this to make sure we have some for Christmas. But
mhm.
you begin to realize, you begin to just have an instinct about that. And I was the other part is I work with students who are writers, and and want to learn about publishing. One of the things I talk about is learning does your gut work about a book. And so you'd have guts that would work. You'd think, oh, that book's going to do well, and it would do well. And then you'd have books that I learned two things. I learned I could love a book and hate a book, and it could work. If
Mhm.
I was bored by a book, that would be another story.
Yeah.
So I learned that myself. But I also think it was testing. I would think, okay, is that coming in? That looks really good. I'd read it. And then you'd see how did it work? Did it work?
Mhm.
And you begin to develop some of that. And that's where the editors in traditional publishing really who work at that and know that that's how they build their careers.
Right.
If you buy a book that does well,
Yeah.
like I know the editor who bought Tom Clancy when he was with the Naval Institute.
Mhm.
It helped make his career.
Right. And it probably helped make the publisher as well.
Yeah. So there's all these stories like that. The person who bought Kathleen Woodowitz, the
Oh,
person who first bought Nora.
I just read a Nora book. I was doing some like backlist reading and she has aged quite well. I mean, except for the chain smoking. I really, really enjoyed the stories. So Lisa asks, how do you think that AI will change publishing or could change publishing?
It's in the midst of trying to figure this out, and I've been talking to attorneys and agents and publishers about this for the last 6 months, and also talking to people at the University of Washington because we have a big computer department there. Um, and of course, Microsoft here. Um, the question is, what is it going to do to a contract? Because if you use AI, how do you copyright it?
Mhm.
And how do you take care of that?
Yep.
And that's the issue of the day. And the question will be is what do publishers ask a writer? And I know that when we work with Ingram Spark and they're beginning to ask, Ingram Book Company, is any of this done by AI? That's in their questions to us now. So that's going to be more and more the questions of the day. And I'm like I said, I'm work with the writing program at the University of Washington, and that's the question we're looking at too. So I don't have an answer for that, but it's something that we're all aware of.
Yeah.
And I think there was a big buzz about it academically to look, but the question then is, are you going to get a bunch of AI stuff that's coming through? Did they write it or what did they do? I don't know the answer,
Yeah.
but it's an
Okay.
issue.
So I have one last question, and then I know you had a couple things that you wanted to end with so we have a few more minutes. Is there any author that you would have liked to meet during your career that you didn't get a chance to?
Boy, that's a really, really, really good question. Well, there's a woman who wrote years ago, but it wasn't a romance author, it was Vera Brittain.
That
She
name-
wrote Testament of Friendship, and she wrote a number of books they were set in post World War One. I always wanted to meet her. I would have loved to meet oh, the woman Maeve Binchy.
Oh yeah.
Dick Francis,
Mhm.
would have loved to meet him. I was fortunate, I think, enough to meet most of the romance writers that I never met Diana Palmer.
Hmm.
I always wanted to meet Diana Palmer.
Mhm.
And Margaret Way. She lives down in Australia. There's a number of people. I'd have to think about that, the number of them. But I was lucky to meet a lot of the people because of the times, because we used to call it, we were all sort of growing up together in the romance industry.
Mhm. And is there anybody currently that you would like to meet?
Yeah, I think I'd like to meet Rebecca Yarros.
Oh, okay.
Kind of interesting to see what's going on with her.
Mhm.
Um,
She's a big
yeah,
name right now.
yeah. Let's see. I'm very fortunate because I've worked in various writers organizations who have writers conferences and stuff.
Mhm.
So one of the things is I bring out my wish list of writers that I want to meet.
Mhm.
And then I think, well, I wonder if we could get them as a keynote speaker.
Mhm.
So I got to meet Jamie Ford last year and Lisa C, who I really like. She's great. Cara Black.
Mhm.
So there's a number of people that I've been able to meet over the years just from that experience. Yeah,
That's good.
I'd have to look on the bestseller list and see. Oh, I'm trying to think. Donna Leone would be interesting.
Mhm. Oh, I love her books. The ones that are set in Italy, right?
Yes, yeah, yeah, I
Oh,
like her a lot.
love them.
Yeah.
Okay, so we just have another minute or two, and I know you wanted to end with some thoughts. This has been so incredibly fascinating.
First place, I want to thank everybody that's come to listen to me, and I want to thank Mina for deciding that I should be interviewed. That was real. I feel very honored to have her do that. For all of you that are writing and writing romance and read romance, I want to thank you. We should always celebrate ourselves for that. It's given me years and years of pleasure, of hope, of understanding relationships, and just at times when I thought, what the heck am I going to do about something? And I would sit down and read a romance novel, and I think, okay, I can keep going. The faith that the writers and the readers have in the genre. Because I remember one little story, one of my first romance conferences I went to, this editor came in and said, are we a fad? Or are we going to be around here next year? And I said, no, we're going to be around here. And so I think love is old, but it is forever new. And I feel that for all the writers who do that, I so appreciate the hours of pleasure that you have given me as a reader.
Mhm.
There's not a day that doesn't go by that I'm grateful and I reread. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
a good
thank you.
book. Yeah,
What?
I was like, a good book is priceless.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it
one that
is.
stays with you and affects you and makes you think. Um, Jennifer, thank you so much for doing this. It's been, like I said, fascinating. We've learned so much just about you and really for me, like bring back some wonderful, wonderful reading memories. So I really appreciate your time.
Oh, well, thank you. And like I said, I so appreciate everybody who reads and writes in the romance, um, and writes, because it's stories that matter.
Absolutely. That is the best line. Stories that matter. And we matter. We women and men who read the romance matter.
Exactly. And that was been my whole goal, is to make sure that women who write and, readers are respected for what they choose to do.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Well,
it's been important.
thank you for blazing that trail. We'll keep working on it because it's
All right.
so important. All right. Well, have a wonderful night, Jennifer. For
Okay.
everybody who's here, have a great night. Happy reading. And I hope to see you again sooner or
Yeah,
later.
me too. Take care. Thank you, everybody.
Good night.
Night.